I'm Michael Green. I'm the CEO of the U.S. Studies Center here at the University of Sydney. We're going to talk about Japan this evening. The U.S. Studies Center was established 15 years ago with an initial focus on U.S.-Australia relations and on American politics and society, but over time has focused more broadly on the Indo-Pacific, and in particular on Japan. We have a large body of work we do with Japanese counterparts and on Japan. We have a program for next generation Japanese and Australian leaders to study in each other's countries. We do work for DFAT, defense. We do projects on Japan's relationship with Australia and strategic position in the Indo-Pacific. And we are coming to the close of one of those research projects. It was funded by the Smith Richardson Foundation, which is an educational foundation in the United States. And they came to us, and when you're an academic, it's good when this happens. They rang us up and said, "We want to give you money." And then they had me at hello. And they said, "We want you to really take a deep dive and try to understand what is happening in Japan." This was in 2022. The Japanese government under Prime Minister Kishida at the time had just issued 3 significant strategic documents: a national security strategy on Japan's overall position in the world, a national defense strategy on how to build up defense, and then a 5-year plan to equip the defense forces. It made big news because it included things like a target of 2% of GDP for defense, close to doubling the amount Japan had spent on defense historically. It included new areas like strike. Historically, Japan had always taken basically purely defensive roles, left the offensive roles to the U.S. So the U.S. was the spear, Japan would be the shield. Changed that. So Japan is now going to develop the ability to strike adversaries and not just expect the U.S. to do it. It included moves to create a joint operational command modeled on Australia's joint operational command, so that the Japanese forces were ready in a crisis. It was driven by a sense of urgency about North Korea and its nuclear weapons capabilities, Russia, particularly after the invasion of Ukraine, and especially, no surprise, China, because of the confrontations over the Senkaku Islands, which China calls the Diaoyutai, and the growing presence of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, not just between Japan and China, but in the Pacific Ocean on the other side of Japan, in the South China Sea, and even now in the Tasman Sea. So there was a real sense of urgency, and the public supported it on the whole because of that. So what we were asked to do in our research project is take a closer look and say, this all sounds good, but how real is it? What does this really mean? And in particular, what does it mean for the US, Japan's closest ally, and Australia, which is Japan's closest security partner in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia? And if there's a real crisis in this region, would Japan really step up? Would Japan really lean in? Would Japan really take risk? Would it do it with the US, with Australia? So we put together a research team of Americans, Japanese, and Australians. We did surveys of experts. We did discussions. We traveled with a delegation from USID and met with the Japanese foreign minister and defense minister and chief of defense forces. So we really got quite into the weeds. And I think for this audience, some of you will be very excited about that, and others will be interested more broadly in what is Japan up to, what is Japan's role. So we'll try to cover both. So when we get to the Q&A, don't feel you have to ask about the range of Japan's new surface-to-surface missile. You can ask about politics or economy or society. And that matters because Japan, of course, is a democracy. And one of the things we want to consider is, with an aging society, with economic interdependence with China, how sustainable is this? So we can broaden the discussion, but really looking forward to it. We're going to Canberra tomorrow. We have one more expert from the US, Yuki Tatsumi. Her plane her flight was canceled from LA, so she's joining us tomorrow in Canberra. So apologies from Mantle, as they call it in Washington, but blame United Airlines. So our speakers, so I'm Mike Green, I'm the CEO of the US Studies Center. I actually am trained as an academic as a Japan scholar. I lived in Japan 5 years. I went to Tokyo University. I worked for a member of the Japanese Diet. I had a bunch of jobs in Japan. I was briefly a martial arts actor on TV. The success of my career is evident in the fact that I'm now a professor at the University of Sydney. And have written many books on Japan, worked on Japan in the Pentagon and in the White House, and published a book a few years ago on Japan. We're also joined by Hirohito Ogi. Ogi-san, this is his first trip to Australia, which surprised me because there's so much interest in Australia in Japan. Ogi-san was in the Defense Ministry. Among other things, he was in the trenches negotiating agreements with Australia on acquisition and logistics. He left the Defense Ministry to become a researcher, and he's at the Asia-Pacific Institute, which is in the International House in Roppongi, if you've ever been, this beautiful old inn with a garden, and leads on a lot of the defense research they do. And so we're thrilled to have Ogi-san here. And Tom Corbin is a research fellow at the US Studies Center, and he works on US-Australia defense relations, Japan-Australia defense relations. He really sort of gets into the coalface and what makes these alliances work or not work. So we'll get into it as a sort of discussion among the three of us, and then I'll open it up for questions. And as I said, I don't think any of us are qualified to answer questions about J-pop or manga, or anime, but about general trends in Japan. Fair game. Let's discuss that context as well. So it's actually a really interesting time for us to be doing this because front page of the AFR and the Australian, for some reason not the Sydney Morning Herald, but the Royal Australian Navy chose yesterday morning, very early in the morning, that the next frigate, more than $10 billion, that the Royal Australian Navy will be introducing into the fleet is the Japanese frigate Mogami. Tom and I actually, I don't know if have you been on Mogami? Yeah, Tom and I went on board the Mogami, the most recent Mogami in the Japanese fleet was that December? In Yokosuka Naval Base. It's an amazing high-tech frigate. This is a really important milestone for Japan's role in defense cooperation with countries like Australia. It's a big deal. The entire Japanese government mobilized to get this successfully across the line. And as an American in government and in think tanks, I've spent a lot of my career encouraging multilateral cooperation, encouraging Japan and Australia to work together, India and Japan, the Quad. That's a lot of my career was working on that. The alliances in Asia were established after the Cold War as a bilateral series of alliances, not like NATO. NATO is a collective security agreement, all for one and one for all. The US-Australia, ANZUS alliance, the US-Japan, US-Korea, Philippines, these were all bilateral. They were not collective security. But all of these democratic, mostly maritime states, particularly Japan and Australia, but also the Philippines, Korea, India, they're all confronting similar challenges and increasingly looking at ways to work together. A large part of it is China. No small part of it is our friend Donald Trump. But the thing that really marks Australia and Japan as allies is neither is looking to replace the US. That is not part of the plan. There is no plan B. If you add up the Japanese Defense Forces and the Australian Defense Forces, you get the US Marine Corps. And that's all. So there is no plan B, but while the US is undergoing a little bit of a reflection, Japan and Australia's relationship has boomed even more as the two pillars of American strategy in Asia and two allies that need the US at the top of its game and that are really exploring remarkable opportunities to work together. Mogami captures all of that. It's been a very, very brief history, and then I'll turn to Ogi-san and Tom. It's been quite a ride. Japan and Australia worked very closely in the late 80s in establishing what became APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, largely around the idea of economics, trade, and a connection of the Pacific with the US. And ultimately a larger liberalization and integration of trade. And that was a Japan-Australia initiative in 89, 90, 91. APEC really was made in Japan and Australia, but it was economics and diplomacy. The security side came later and took some time. I, in the White House, was in charge of the first US, Japan, Australia trilateral security talks. First we'd ever had in 2001. For DFAT veterans in the room, it was the idea of, you'd know him, Richard, Ashton Calvert. Fantastic Australian diplomat, fluent in Japanese, sadly passed away, I guess, about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Loved Japan. It was his idea. Australia and Japan had not really had a robust security discussion before. Another high water mark came in Iraq. Japan deployed a battalion of engineers to Iraq to do humanitarian work. But at the time, they were not allowed to use weapons. They were only allowed to defend themselves if they were directly attacked. And the nature of that campaign was you couldn't just wait to be attacked. You needed to be patrolling. So the Dutch Marines protected Japan's battalion. And then in 2004, the Dutch said, we're rotating out. And the Australian government came to the US and said, we'd like to raise our hand and have the RAR, have Australia play that role. And I've spoken to John Howard about it, who was Prime Minister at the time. I was in the White House. And they were a bit worried about the RSL, Returned Servicemen's League, because of the experiences of the Second World War. And so when the Howard government sort of reached out to the RSL, they got an enthusiastic response to working with Japan. In 2007, Howard and Prime Minister Abe issued a joint security declaration. Abbott did one with Abe in 2012, and then Prime Minister Albanese and Prime Minister Kishida in October 2022, if I got my dates right, issued a joint declaration from Perth, which was not a treaty, but when you read it, it sounds like ANZUS. The language is the language you use in a security treaty. So we did a survey at the center, and we asked about 2,000 Australians in a large-scale survey, if Australia had a security treaty with Japan, like the security treaty with the US, would you support it? And 74% of Australians said yes. And in Lowy's polls, correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, Japan is always the most trusted country in the Indo-Pacific for Australians. And the Japanese government in 2002 issued a cabinet decree which officially made Australia Japan's closest security partner after the US. And interestingly, the language says closest security partner in the Indo-Pacific. So as an American official, I always said, but we are part of the Indo-Pacific. But closest after the US and closest in the Indo-Pacific. So in remarkable growth. And yet, frankly, sometimes, despite the enormous affection and trust, I will say as a third-party observer, Australia and Japan still have quite a bit to learn about each other. And in particular, how to do industrial work, how to do defense. So it's a growth industry for government officials and think tanks. So let's get to our experts. Thank you for letting me do that introduction. And let's start with Mogami, the big news of the day. I'm surprised the press didn't pick up on this, but the name of the ship that sank the HMAS Canberra was the Imperial Japanese ship Mogami. So really water under the bridge. Mogami, Ogi-san, from a Japanese perspective, and you follow shipbuilding and naval strategy a lot, what does the Mogami decision mean for Japan?
Thank you, Dr. Green. Thank you for having me to this wonderful event. Just by seeing the news yesterday, I remember I was transferred to ATRA, the Acquisition Technology and Logistic Agency, which is a promoter for defense export in Japan. I was transferred to ATRA in 2016, summer of 2016, and the 3 or 4 months before the transfer, Japan lost the deal on Soryu submarine, the conventional powered submarine. So the atmosphere at the ATRA was like a funeral. everyone was depressed, and so they needed to learn lessons from the failure of that experience. And one of the lesson is cross coordination between the government and the industry, giving the industry from the government to industry more predictability of international businesses. And also there should be a cross coordination between the promoter in the government, that is ATRA, and the regulator at the METI about the export control. If the two functions work contrary to each other, that would signal the wrong message to the industry. So I think this time the Mogami deal was based on these lessons, and I think the related the organization, the government organization, the industry, played an active role in promoting this deal as a one team. So that is the number one characteristic. But having said that, I'm pretty much, I should be realistic about the nature of the deal, because this Mogami deal is totally different from Soryu deal. Just simply the capability Japan can offer matches the requirements of the Australian Navy. The Soryu class submarine was a diesel propulsion submarine, and it does not have a long range cruising range the Australian Navy wanted to have. So there's a complete mismatch in the Soryu deal. By contrast, this time the Mogami class frigate, or the newer Mogami type frigate, has a long range of operational endurance, and it can be equipped with large volume of firepower, including VLS and missiles, anti-air, anti-ship missiles, and ASW capability as well, countermining capability, and it can save manpower to operate this frigate. So Japan and Australia now are interested in how to secure the Pacific Ocean, the sea, especially the coastal area. So we share the strategic objectives with each other. So that is why Japan could develop a Mogami class frigate, and now upgrading this capability to a newer FFM. And the Australia was interested in to co-develop this function. I would touch upon the second aspect of this deal, that is a symmetrical, equal partnership. The Japan and Australia have been kind of suffering from the over-reliance of US-made defense equipment. Of course, both countries have had good alliances with the United States, but this different implication has arisen from the industrial perspective. That is the autonomy to decide the exact timing of introducing newer capabilities, and the timing of modernization, timing of maintenance and overhaul. Usually, the older armed forces, including self-defense forces, Australian forces, seek to have such autonomy in defense capability building. In that context, Japan can offer an equal partnership, symmetrical relation. Sometimes it is criticized because of the lack of experience in international businesses, but nevertheless, Australia pledged to have mutual deal, mutual relationship about co-development. So that means that it is not the simple relation between the seller and the buyer. It is a co-participation project. So I think we would more and more similar cases of symmetrical defense industrial cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So those partnerships are easily observed in Europe, but less observed in the Indo-Pacific. But we will see more cases.
Interesting. And Tom, from an Australian perspective, what does the Mogami decision mean in terms of capability, strategy, industry?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. I think I'm going to touch on a lot of what Augie-san said and just kind of recast it from an Australian perspective, because I think there is a lot of overlap here in terms of the significance of this decision for the Australia-Japan relationship. On a very basic level, it's doing what ministers in both countries have said they've been seeking to do for the last couple of years, which is to put our deep strategic alignment, which is reflected in the way our governments talk about the regional strategic environment and challenges that we face, into practical action. There have been some, other smaller, lower profile developments over the last couple of years that have represented that too. But in my view, this is perhaps the biggest expression of that to date, not least because of, to go to what Augie-san mentioned before, it somewhat dispels the ghosts of 2016 and the decision not to go with the Soryu-class submarine. Even if that decision was made with Australia's best defense capability interests at heart, it did still haunt the strategic partnership with Japan for the decade thereafter. And I'm hoping that this decision will help to put those ghosts to bed somewhat, to mean that our future cooperation doesn't necessarily have that hanging in the background of something that might come and snatch it out from us as we're trying to put it into practice. On a very basic capability level, like this is a good capability decision for Australia. Augie-san did a very good job of going through all the specs of the ship that make it a good decision for Australia, but it's fairly manpower efficient, which for a small country like Australia, which already has some pretty serious workforce challenges in the defence force in particular, the more manpower we can save, the better. It's got a high volume, it's got a high payload, so it can carry, I think, nearly double the missiles that the German frigate was offering, which for a small navy that has to operate over vast oceans with no at-sea reload option to speak of, besides pulling into allied ports, the more ordnance you can carry on the ship, the better from an operational sustainment perspective, and making Australia's broader maritime deterrent capability as credible and far-ranging as possible. It's also broadly consistent with Australian strategy. More agency and more partners. On the agency point, having the sort of capability that the Mogami exemplifies is going to allow Australia to be a more active participant in the region as a security partner, not just for Japan, not just for the United States, but also for many other countries in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia that are looking to Australia as a partner in an increasingly uncertain regional strategic environment. And I would note that Australia is not the only country that has been considering the Mogami. Our closest and perhaps most important neighbor in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, has also been considering the Mogami as a potential defense acquisition of its own. So there are some synergies there in terms of, defense interoperability, defense industrial partnerships that may go just beyond the Australia-Japan dimension. And then maybe just finally, I'm hoping, and this is a personal hope of mine more than anything, but I'm hoping that this will lead to a broader cultural shift in the Australian defence ecosystem, in government, in industry, and further beyond that, that is open to considering non-Western sources of defence capability as viable options for Australian strategic policy. I think that has been a key reason why suppliers like Japan, but also other companies from countries like South Korea, for example, which has also been seeking to establish a foothold in Australia. That is part of the reason why they have not found as much success, is because of a cultural bias or a kind of a narrow tunnel vision within the Australian defence community to look at US capability, to look at European capability and say that is the best and we need to have it. That may still be the case in a lot of instances. American military hardware is still best in class in most cases. We don't necessarily need best in class. We need good enough. And countries like Japan are in a position to provide that on a faster timeline and to Australian requirements, with often better conditions to the deal around things like technology transfer that aren't as restrictive in terms of how we use those capabilities thereafter or who else we share that technology with. Partners like Japan and Korea are better positioned to do that in some cases than the United States, in my view. So overall, I think this is a very good decision for Australia.
I agree with all that. I'd add two more. One of the specifications of the Mogami that I assume was very important for the Royal Australian Navy was, unlike the German frigate, it's fast and it's designed to keep up with the U.S. carrier battle group. So interoperability with Australia, interoperability with the U.S., it's a twofer. And the other one, I mean, I'm not sure what the Germans were offering, but this is a significant industrial uplift for Australia. The first, 3 mogami will be provided right off the line. In fact, in an indication of how much the Japanese government is eager to build strategic ties with Australia, it's taking the next mogami under this deal that was meant for the Japanese Navy and giving it to Australia. That's how important this is to Tokyo. But after that, the next, is it 6 or 7 or 8? Frigates will be built in Australia. And so it's not just Mitsubishi Heavy, apparently. It's about 24 subcontractors and firms will be moving to mostly Western Australia, but all over Australia, building capacity, hiring people, training people. So it's a significant uplift. That also, by the way, is good for the US. In world shipbuilding right now, the US, which once accounted for 60%, now accounts for 2%, less than 2% of shipbuilding. China has the most, but Japan and Korea combined are just behind China. So shipbuilding capability in the Western Pacific, with everything that means in terms of being able to sustain American ships or British ships, this coalition capability is also a big plus. So it's all around a good choice. I think the questions people had were basically, having never done this, could Japan do it? And my sense is the Japanese side won that argument by pointing out that Mitsubishi Heavy has never been late delivering to the Japanese military. So I got an email early yesterday from a member of the Japanese cabinet who's a friend of mine who said, he said in English, "We did it." And we finally broke the old curse. And he was not talking about the Soryu submarine decision. He was talking about the entire post-war Japanese posture in Asia. That this, I'd say almost ideologically or politically, for a lot of Japanese political leaders, is a real momentous turning point in terms of Japan being recognized as a important provider of security. And that within Japanese politics was really important to validate what's happening. So let's step back from the frigate. And Ogi-san, I'll turn to you first, but these are remarkable changes that Japan is undergoing. When Prime Minister Abe changed the interpretation of Japan's peace constitution to allow Shuranteki Jeiken, collective defense, joint operations, that was a big change 10 years ago. We're now at the next big sort of transformation. But sometimes when we look at Japan, it's a transformation compared to what came before. So compared to Japan's post-war history, this is a big change. But looking at the challenge, the military challenge, the technological challenge, is it really that big a change? Or put another way, is it enough change? When you study this in Tokyo, Ogi-san, what aspects of Japan's defense transformation are encouraging, and what still is not fit for purpose?
Thank you for the question. And sorry for the starting again with my personal anecdote. When I quit the government position, my former boss kind of threatened me that there's no public demand for knowledge about Japan's defense policy, both domestically and internationally. But obviously, it was the wrong assumption. I think this room's audience, the showcasing that analysis was wrong. Japan's the change in its defense policy after 2022 attracted both domestic and international attention. And from international standpoint, that is primarily because of the severity of Taiwan issue. During 2000s, Japan has suffered from the issue surrounding Senkaku. And at that time, probably, of course, this is a critical national interest issue for Japan. But from the international standpoint, it is kind of a local issue, not the world issue. But the Taiwan issue is different in terms of its possible civility, the horizontal escalation risk. And Japan exists in the center of gravity to address the Taiwan issue, especially the Southwest Islands, including Okinawa and some Kyushu areas, have the really strategic importance. And if Japan strengthens the defense capabilities in the center of gravity, it can completely change China's strategic calculation. That is why international observers are quite interested in the developments of Japanese defense policy. And from a domestic standpoint, it actually altered the mindset of Japanese public, including Japanese defense industries. So it kind of prompted the Japanese people that defense-related business is not a bad thing. Actually, it contributes to Japan's national security. So maybe it is a side effect, but this non-material effect of altering the mindset of Japanese people has been crucial for Japanese policymaking. Having said that, I would slightly touch upon three main challenges we are facing now. The current defense buildup program ends at fiscal year 2027. And since after 2028, we need to have another defense budget package program. And maybe we will see further increase in defense spending. But there's a really hectic, long-standing issue, a trade-off between how to allocate the limited resources between social security policy and national security and defense. So I think the current generation in Japan are dissatisfied, pretty much dissatisfied with the government social security policy because it exacerbates generational unfairness and inequality, and that will kind of contribute to as a constraint to further increase the defense spending after 2028. So that is number one challenge. The second challenge would be the quantitative quantitative buildup of the self-defense forces. Even though the 2022 strategic documents added new capabilities like long-range missiles and unmanned assets, the actual number of SDF personnel hasn't changed at all. And the major force structure of three services of the self-defense forces haven't changed at all. Maritime self-defense force, the plans to maintain 54 battleships, and the air self-defense force slightly increased the goal number of fighter jets and other operational aircraft. Ground self-defense force hasn't changed the force posture much, even though they would be equipped with long-range missiles. The conventional legacy brigades and divisions are maintained. So this is kind of a politically difficult task to dramatically modify the basic force posture, and it was postponed. It has been postponed, and we really need to address this issue because it has been a homework. The third issue, the industrial capacity, the shortage of manpower, shortage of upfront investment in the side of defense contractors, that would be a bottleneck for further increasing our defense capabilities.
So the last one is a problem for Australia, it's a problem for the US, it's a problem for Europe. In theory, if we're doing more federated work together, that should ease it, but we'll see. On the first one, on the defense spending, I came away from meetings in Tokyo before the election, pretty much convinced that within the LDP, they were preparing to increase defense spending again. Japan's at about 2%, or will be next year, which is Australia's about 2%. There was a political consensus within the leadership, I found, to go to 2.4 or 5% in the next defense plan. But then they lost the election. And none of the other parties that won ran against defense spending, but they did run on tax cuts. And so funding the defense increase while cutting taxes becomes a problem for the bond market. So now it's much more complicated. What's your sense of the impact of the election on all of this?
I completely agree with your observation. There has been two politically influential actors in Japanese foreign policy and defense policy making. One is Prime Minister's leadership, and his staff members at Kante, Prime Minister Office. This work has worked as a driving force of defense policy. And the other is the battle power, the finance ministry, the budget authority. And if the Prime Minister's leadership, LDP government's leadership over the bureaucracy is weakened as a result of the loss of this general election, maybe the result would be the more veto power by the budget authority, and that also included how to tax, increase the taxes, and how to appropriate, how to issue more bonds. This is a very politically difficult task, and maybe the weak prime ministership cannot control this aspect.
And your second point about Japan's aging society, the difficulty of recruiting is definitely a challenge. It is really interesting that about 8 years ago, the Japanese military opened up every profession to women, including commanding destroyers, fighter pilots. The US, and Australia took years and years to figure this out, but just because they needed people, the Japanese government very quickly opened up and began recruiting more women because it's such a challenge in an aging society. On the other hand, that's why the Mogami has a smaller crew and more automation. And in the era of drones and autonomy, maybe maybe there's a silver lining. Maybe Japan will really be at the cutting edge of autonomy and drones. Tom, we just are finishing up the Talisman Saber exercise, 19 countries, 45,000 troops, big Japanese presence, working with the ADF. What are some of the things that you see coming now after the Mogami decision that will be markers of the Japan-Australia security relationship?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, large Japanese contingent at this year's Talisman Saber for the fourth or fifth edition running now. And they've become increasingly sophisticated and high-end in terms of the capabilities that have been sent over that period. I'd say a highlight from this year, but also from last year, was the fact that the Japanese forces who were in Australia participating in the exercise conducted missile launches at Australian ranges. Not a joint launch necessarily, but the fact that Japan brought its anti-ship missile capabilities to Australian test ranges to fire them, I think is an indication of where Australia and Japan may go next in terms of defense industrial or defense technology cooperation. Japan is land poor. It doesn't have many missile testing ranges either on the land of Japan. It only has a small number of testing ranges over the ocean surrounding Japan, which are fairly easily surveilled by the PLA, by the Chinese Navy. Moving some of those exercises down to Australia, not only in a unilateral sense for Japan, but also in collaboration with Australia, perhaps also with the United States, is a pretty logical move, considering that not only are our three countries all looking for more missile numbers, that is, greater numbers of the missiles we know we can already build, but we're also looking to build the next generation of missile technologies, particularly hypersonics, both offensive and defensive capabilities, and this would directly feed into that. To riff off Talisman Saber again, I think we're in a moment where Australia, Japan, and the United States, critically, in that trilateral mechanism, are trying to think of ways to move beyond the scripted exercise format. Talisman Saber is great for demonstrating high-end coordination. It's great for drilling interoperability. But the fact is, when you're out there in the region and if a security crisis happens, there is no script to read from. You don't know what is going to happen next. You need to be prepared for anything. And in order to prepare for that, Australia, Japan, and the United States need to be moving from those scripted exercises towards unscripted operations that are happening in the real world, in response to real world events, in response to real world unpredictability. That's going to be important if our defense cooperation is going to mean anything at all, quite frankly, when it comes to regional deterrence challenges. If we're only cooperating in scripted formats and we're just reading from the script and we're going tick, 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 done, wasn't that a great demonstration of interoperability? That's not going to mean a lot. So we need to move past that. And we're starting to see that, I think, particularly around Japan, some trilateral maritime domain awareness operations, some intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations. I would expect to see more of those kind of engagements outside of the Sea of Japan and across Southeast Asia. And then just perhaps on force posture outside of Talisman Sabre, there are discussions going on about what a more permanent rotational Japanese troop presence in Australia might look like. There are a couple of precedents there we could look at. So US Marines have rotated through Australian facilities for over a decade now, as have US aircraft of all types, increasingly. Perhaps less well known is the arrangement we have with Singapore, another land poor country, another country that needs testing ranges, needs a strong or reliable Western partner that is not necessarily the United States to work with in the region and to provide a reliable and a high quality place to do military training. There has been a formal agreement now between Australia and Singapore for some years to that effect. Singaporean fighter jets come here to exercise, including with Australian forces. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some kind of similar arrangement surfacing in the Australia-Japan context in the coming years, particularly if you think back to last year and the final conclusion of the reciprocal access agreement between Australia and Japan that was over a decade in the making. The first thing that happened there was that Japanese F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft flew to Australia. And now Australian F-35s have made a return journey to Japan. That's great for demonstrating that that agreement works, but it has to be for something. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see Japanese ground forces and Japanese air forces conducting some kind of more regular exercise-focused rotations through Australia in the first place. Where that may go after that is an open question, noting that Australia and the US use those joint force posture initiatives for operations too. There's no reason Japan couldn't be part of that in the future, and I wouldn't be surprised if it is.
So when you're in an alliance and you're on the front lines and you don't have 10 years warning time, you might have 24, 48 hours warning time. What you do is you create a joint and combined command. So that's what NATO is, and that's what the US-Korea Combined Forces Command is, because you don't have time to have sort of consultations in government and parliamentary inquiries. You need to be ready to go quickly and to be adaptable. And creating that kind of combined command is politically very sensitive, because each side is ceding, or seems to be ceding, a bit of sovereignty or freedom of action. The US and Korea did it because there was no choice, because the Korean War ended with an armistice and could reopen at any time. And NATO did it because the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact had overwhelming force right on the Fulda Gap. The US-Japan alliance now is moving in that direction very quickly. Japan has set up its Joint Operational Command. The US is going to upgrade its command in Japan. They will have a very close relationship, even if they aren't an actual combined command. What about Australia? Should Australia be in that? What do you think, Ogi-san?
You mean the kind of an integrated command and control?
Australians, if you go to the Indo-Pacific Command, there are Australian generals and admirals everywhere. When I worked in the White House, I went with President Bush to Korea. The briefing for the President of the United States on the North Korean threat was done by an Australian Air Force officer who was part of the UN command. So Australia is very integrated in US commands, but now the US and Japan are moving closer together. Is there a role, do you think, for Australia in that? And I'll ask you next.
Yeah, I think there should be. Based on the bilateral framework of ISR analysis between Japan and the United States, Australia decided to participate in the joint trilateral ISR analysis cell in Japan. I think it's in Yokota. So there will be more and more participation in command and control element, and the SAF, the Japanese government, I don't think there are major kind of challenges to invite Australian, for instance, liaison officers into the Japanese commanding components. And in terms of combined C2 and surely the taking into account the severity of the possible Taiwan contingency, we really need real-time, near real-time information sharing and decision sharing between not only with the United States but also with Australia. But this is a tricky issue in not only in Japan but in U.S. forces as well, because the Japan, the meaning of Japanese archipelago has a versatile implications. It is against North Korean threat. It is against China. And U.S. forces exist in Japan not only for deterrence against China, but also the augmentation of operations in Korea. So the complete integration, complete combined C2 would be at the current stage not realistic. So 2 years ago, I contributed to a commentary to the USSC website. In that article, I proposed to set up a sort of a task force, the bilateral task forces comprised
U.S., Australia, Japan,
and U.S. forces. The combine the part of units to one force for a specific mission, depending on the natures of the mission. Such sort of flexible arrangement could be possible under kind of under the tactical control of one commander. That could be a U.S. commander.
Tom, what do you think?
I think that's where it's going. There are increasing numbers of Australian military personnel who are being seconded or embedded in different Japanese Defense Force institutions. They're being invited to major US-Japan exercises where there are command and control coordination elements going on. I think it is with a longer term view to creating some kind of arrangement. I don't want to speculate as to what it might look like, but some kind of arrangement where it is possible for our three countries to have an arrangement that resembles that kind of level of coordination, because I think our three countries agree that this partnership, this trilateral, is the core of collective regional deterrence strategy as far as we are concerned. There may be other partners who can plug in at some point, but in Canberra, in Tokyo, and DC, it's our three countries that are going to be the most reliable and probably going to be there. In order for that to be successful, though, I think there are also two important discussions that Australia also needs to have on a bilateral basis with the United States and Japan. Compared to the US-ROK alliance and even compared to the US-Japan alliance, the institutionalization of the US-Australia alliance is actually quite thin when it comes to having the formal established mechanisms to discuss things like joint planning, joint operations on a regular basis. There are means to have these discussions, but they're just not formalized in a way that they would need to be in order to plug into something like this. And then a similar discussion needs to be had between Australia and Japan. But in my view, I think that's part of a bigger conversation that Australia and Japan need to have apart from the United States, which is, aside from supporting the trilateral enterprise, which is extremely important for our two countries, what is the purpose of Australia-Japan defense cooperation beyond that? That is a question I think that deserves more attention than it is currently getting. If you look at the way that a lot of Australia-Japan statements link what they are doing at a bilateral level to trilateral collaboration with the US, again, this is important for signaling shared intent and for actually getting after a credible collective deterrence strategy. But we can't just look at that as the single objective for Australia defense cooperation with Japan. We need to have a discussion about what it means at the bilateral level, because there may be instances where Australia and Japan want to get after a problem. The United States can't or won't participate for reasons unknown. We need to be prepared for that situation.
So this is a very sophisticated audience, and I will assume that none of you watched a movie that came out 12 years ago called Battleship. And it was a kind of a high-tech movie where aliens invade Earth. and they land in Hawaii during a big exercise, military naval exercise, and they freeze all the ships, but a Japanese frigate and a U.S. frigate get away. So the Japanese and American crews have to work together, and the captains don't like each other, and they got in a fight playing soccer before the exercise, and in the end they have to try to cooperate, the U.S. and Japan, to save civilization from the aliens. And in the last scene, they win. They figure out how to destroy the alien ship, but the alien fires one last missile that's hurtling towards the Japanese frigate, the only one left. So the Japanese and American captains look at each other and they say, "It's been an honor serving with you, sir." "No, sir, the honor is mine." It's very Hollywood. And this missile screaming in, and all of a sudden the missile blows up, and an F-18 squadron goes flying by that saves them. And you have to watch it about 5 times to see it, but the F-18s are Royal Australian Air Force. So and you're thinking, this guy is not a serious scholar. So I was pretty close to Prime Minister Abe. I worked in the LDP. I knew him a long time. And I saw him shortly after the movie came out. And I mentioned this to him. He said, I noticed that. He's the only person I know who actually noticed that. So go watch Battleship. Go to the last scene. If you look closely, you'll see the F-18s are Australian. We're not there. We don't have that, there is no Asian NATO. And I'll turn to the audience in just a sec. One of the things I'll say as an American who lived in Japan 5 years and speaks Japanese and who's now learning Australian. One of the things that really has struck me, going back and forth between Tokyo and Canberra and Sydney, is that for all of this alignment, for all of the trust, for all of the momentum, you have a debate in Australia in the public domain about Taiwan. And one view is, why would we help the Americans fight a war for primacy over Taiwan? And the other view is, well, we've always helped the Americans. And it's a quite binary debate publicly in Australia, not in Japan. You really don't hear that in Japan. You did 20 years ago. But in Japan, I think the assumption among scholars and government officials and politicians is there is no neutrality for Japan in any Taiwan scenario, just because of geography. Personally, I think that's true for Australia, if you look at the way the Chinese are, the PLA is exercising. But that is a big difference in tone between the politics in Japan and all this and the politics in Australia. What's your view on that, Tom? And what's your view on that, Ogi-san? I think the problem's not going away. And both governments are going to have to confront that. But that's the one area that sort of hangs over all this or underlies all of this is, if you look at what the Japanese cabinet says about the security environment, it's not as hysterical as the U.S. can get, but it has a sense of real urgency in many, many government documents and speeches. You don't really hear that at the political level in Canberra. Is that a problem, or is it okay to have a somewhat different tone and just work at it under the surface?
I think it's okay to have a slightly different tone if we are working at it under the surface. And if there is a sufficient public conversation about Taiwan in the Australian context. And my concern at the moment is that there isn't, really. I don't blame ministers or government officials for ducking questions from journalists about Taiwan when they are put to them, because they're often leading questions about, so would you pre-commit to a prospective war over Taiwan that the US may start?
Even talking about the threat is not a popular thing in
no,
cabinet.
but that's what I'm getting at, is that we need to talk about that as a regional flashpoint, because we talk about North Korea as a regional flashpoint. We talk about the South China Sea as a regional flashpoint. The Taiwan Strait is a regional flashpoint. And whether we like it or not, we have to be prepared to talk about it with the United States, but also with Japan. And I mean, I'm thinking off the top of my head here, because it's raised some interesting questions about maybe that gap that we seem to be trying to close in the Australia-US alliance around the conversation about Taiwan. I think we also need to have that conversation in the Australia-Japan case.
What do you think, Ogi-san? Japanese politicians get in front of the press and basically say, please ask me about China. I mean, they're quite used to now talking about the challenge. And yet Japan, Australia's trade relationship with China is more Australia trades more to China as a percentage of its trade than Japan does, but Japan's quite dependent on China, much more than the U.S. economically. So Tokyo has both sides of the relationship, but its politicians and political leaders are quite open talking about the challenge side.
I think it is natural to observe the difference between the Japanese and the Australian discussion because of the difference of the geography. As you mentioned, the geography of Japanese archipelago is so important for basing U.S. forces which would operate in the East China Sea or in the Western Pacific as a whole, and it is also critical for the operation for Japanese self-defense forces. I also think that there will be no luxury for Japan to stay neutral in the Taiwan contingency. So I think this is a driving force to kind of prompt the discussion in Japanese politics. But one thing which is missing in the Japanese policy discussion is whether or not we should amend U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation Guideline. It was articulated in 2015 when Japan, the government enacted peace and security legislation, which enabled the self-defense forces to the exercise corrective self-defense, the right of corrective self-defense. But it is, at that time, I would say that it is kind of a hypothetical occasion and not integrated into the seamless crisis analysis from the gray zone, Taiwan contingency, and the horizontal escalation to the Japanese territory. So I think on the part of corrective self-defense part or the part of the situation of armed attack against Japanese territory, there should be more focus on the focused analysis of the possible Taiwan contingency. So some components or operations are missing from the document, such as anti-air operation, anti-ship operations in the Western Pacific. So probably we should discuss before the U.S. government the demands or propose to its Japanese counterparts.
Yeah. I would just say this isn't about political pre-commitment. A conversation with Japan or with the United States in which Australia participates is not about pre-committing to some distant war that may be the cause of any number of factors. It's about preparing for if that happens and setting expectations of each other and what we could actually bring to the table. Because Australian capability is limited, as Ogi-san noted, where we are geographically distant. That doesn't mean we couldn't contribute to a regional contingency in Taiwan or further north in Northeast Asia. But we need to talk about what we might do or what we could do if that happened without politically pre-committing to something.
Yeah, my guess is the contingency will come to you. So, and if it's easier, the U.S. doesn't pre-commit either. The entire security commitment to Taiwan, such as it is based on the Taiwan Relations Act. Yeah. So look, this is great. We'll go to the audience. I think it will be, I can tell you in Washington, on a bipartisan basis, there is enthusiasm for Japan and Australia working together and U.S., Japan, and Australia working together. One additional benefit of this is that right now the U.S. government, the Trump administration, is hyper-focused on Taiwan. Almost myopically focused on Taiwan, and is pulling back development assistance and diplomacy in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And I think that's one strategic area where Japan and Australia are exactly aligned. The need to focus on, not just the pointy end of the spear and the worst scenario, but the entire region. So that, there's a Japanese word, gaiatsu pressure. I think Australia, Japan, gaiatsu in the US would be very welcome. All right, let's open it up for questions. Yes, sir. Up front here, and yeah.
Ed Scaveras, I'm an economist. In light of the concern in AUKUS about America's manufacturing capability, I was concerned to hear what you said with respect to Japan's capability in terms of manpower and manufacturing capacity, not only for the first 3 frigates, but if they're serious about coming back to Australia for the 8. Is there any provision for the first 3 to send any Australians over to participate and learn in the first 3? And in terms of the 8, has there been any specified structure in terms of training Australians? And of course, Australia can't even make washing machines. What provision is there for infrastructure to do that? Or is it just being left? And like I said, my concern is what's happening with AUKUS could be repeated.
Thank you for the question. I think there are some, at present, there are some options for the Japanese government to do the finance things like JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation, can cover the international cooperation projects that could hypothetically include the defense, international defense deals. So that it may include offering offer the lower interest rate financing loan. So that would be one option. And this hasn't tried by the Japanese defense companies, but Japanese companies are accustomed to the licensed production of the US-made weapons. Maybe from the now on, Japanese companies have to think about the reverse version of licensed production, the technological transfer, including the training of the high-skilled engineers from Japan to Australia. There's no such the fixed format of technological transfer, but this is something we need to focus on. The Japanese shipbuilding companies are, getting many increasing defense contract from the MOD, Defense Ministry, and so probably it is possible to manufacture 3 ships for Australia as an initial stage, but it is very beneficial for the Japanese side as well to create the manufacturing capacity in Australia to mitigate the competing demand between the domestic demand and international demand.
Mitsubishi Heavy is not a struggling company. If you invested in Mitsubishi Heavy stock, 6-7 years ago, you would have made, is it 600% profit? So 7 times. So the financing's there. I don't think there would be very much exchange yet because the Defense Department here couldn't really do that during a competitive bid, right? They couldn't tip their hand. Now that the decision's been made, I expect you'll see a real significant increase of workers and engineers and stuff going back and forth. Sorry? Well, Australia has shipbuilding, but that's part of the plan is to bring over more capacity.
Yeah, I mean, Australian workers should be going to Japanese shipyards to learn the skills, to learn the process as part of this agreement. Because as Augie-san indicated, I think there's a mutual benefit there. And just with the AUKUS comparison, I think we're talking about 2 slightly different things here. I share your concerns around workforce requirements and production rates with respect to AUKUS. But I would say that in the AUKUS context, we formulated this agreement with, quite frankly, the full knowledge of the state of the US industrial base. And AUKUS in some ways is intended to try and help alleviate those problems. In the context with the Mogami, as Dr. Green has said several times, MHI has a pretty good record, or very good record, in terms of delivering on time. So not actively trying to solve a scheduling problem there. We're trying to keep it level. And your excellent suggestion, in my view, that Australian workforce should be part of keeping that production rate stable for both our countries is really well taken.
It is a challenge. I have seen surveys where engineering graduates from Australian universities, when they list where they want to work, defense industry, shipbuilding, aerospace doesn't rank that high. But when engineers already in the workforce are questioned about how do you like your job, they're among the most satisfied and enjoying their work the most. So there's a bit of a cultural society workforce training transformation that's going to have to happen in Australia. Japan's very good at that stuff, very good at that. So I think the injection of ideas and talent and financing should help. Other questions? We don't just have to talk about frigates and missiles. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Very interesting. I think some of us may have woken up this morning and heard ABC News Radio cover Hiroshima, 80 years since Hiroshima, and a couple of hibakusha were interviewed as well. And then maybe some of us also read the New York Times today and saw an article about Hiroshima and questioning whether it is peace that Japanese people really want today. And then today, our enlightening discussion. So I've had a wonderful day of thought about these things. And so just, I guess, a couple of observations and questions, mostly to do with the movie Battleship, by the way.
Have you actually seen it?
No, I haven't. But I'm going to have to go watch it.
You seem like a serious scholar. I don't want to ruin your time.
Looks can be deceiving. So I guess I'm wondering about the populations of Australia and Japan, and particularly younger people, and their interest in something like this. Surely something like this could be great for the economy, for our exchange. But how does the general population feel about this? Is there support? And I guess another observation I made that although we did a lot of talk about the trilateral cooperation, there's a theme that's hard to ignore, that there's a move to have less dependence on the United States, especially perhaps in the current administration, when we're not really sure how the administration might react. So that's...
Yeah. So Ogi-san, do you want to say something about, so the Japanese sort of pacifist culture, what happened to it? You know, this is the anniversary of Hiroshima too. My sense is that pacifist culture and support for increasing defense spending exist side by side, as sort of counterintuitive as that seems. But what's you're very close to this, Ogi-san. What's your view?
I can't represent the general public opinion, but the Japanese still maintains the pacifist culture in the sense that generally they do not initiate aggression war against any other countries, but at the same time, by the term pacifism, we should differentiate the defensive action, military actions against the armed attack, and just invading war. So we are sticking to the defensive posture in general, but we are because of the severity of the security environment, there's a growing awareness of being prepared for the possible aggression in the Japanese public. And there's no negative sentiment in the Japanese population toward the cooperation with and exchange with Australia. That is for sure. And the dependence on the U.S., I think the security bilateral relation with alliance with the United States has been robust and will be robust in the future. There's a complete, near complete convergence of strategic interest between the two countries, as long as the U.S. has strong interest in the Western Pacific, in the Pacific area. So I don't have any concern about that, even though the current Trump administration is a kind of outlier in some respect. I don't have any concern about that. But in terms of capacity, there would be some constraints and limit of what the United States can offer in the future. So that is why we need to enhance our own capability in terms of defense industrial policy, and we need to seek supplementary alternative options for with other partners, including Australia.
The polling's interesting on this. In Japan, younger Japanese are hawkish and support the alliance. In the US, younger Americans are the most pro-alliance. Australia is a bit different. In Australia, in our surveys, and maybe in Lowy's, I don't know, on things like AUKUS or the alliance, which have pretty robust support in Australia, the gaps you find are gender. Women support the alliance and AUKUS by 15 to 20 points less in our polls in Australia, and the younger generation, which is not, which is focused on climate and a lot of other issues. So the three countries are not moving exactly in the same direction in terms of these demographics. But Lowy's poll was a month ago that showed the lowest trust in the United States by Australians ever in 15 years of polling or something like that. 80% of Australians said the alliance is important. In Japan, the numbers that trust the US right now, they ask about Donald Trump, it's even lower. It's about 16 or 17% trust Donald Trump. But support for the alliance in Japan is over 90%. And in some polls, it's 95%. So there's a kind of a cold calculation that there is no plan B, and that the Americans will get their act together. But fingers crossed. And the reduction of dependence makes sense for the reasons Tom and Ogi-san said, but it's not absolute, it's relative. And I think my sense is that within government in Tokyo and Canberra, the game is not primarily about reducing dependence, it's about agency. So how do you shape American decision-making? How do you get in there, which Australia has done for a long time and Japan's quite successful at? In fact, other than maybe the UK, Japan and Australia are the most influential in American strategy. So I think that's another very important part of the game. And Japan and Australia working together increases both sides, agency in Washington, which is a crazy town right now. I mean, the American public opinion supports alliances, but the president is after a lot of things, tariffs, a lot of things. So how to, shape that decision-making is particularly interesting right now. And I think one reason, frankly, why Japan and Australia are moving closer together, it's not just the China threat or economics, it's, neither has a plan B, so how do we get this right in Washington? I think Ambassador Yamada and Ambassador Rudd are probably pretty tight. Other questions? Yeah. In the back. Oh, we have an actual naval shipbuilding expert.
No. Thank you so much. So it's really good opportunity to go back to the basics. So none of you mentioned the Japanese constitution in the discussion. When it comes to the combined command, I think it is inevitable in some case. Australia was under the Allied force commanding from 1941 to 1945, even without the formal alliance with the United States. So if war takes place over Taiwan, well, it's inevitable that Japan will be part of the combined command. But in Japan, is it really possible under the current constitution have the combined command with the United States or other country? I know there's a Sonritsu Kikijidai, like a survival threatened situation, and the Juo Jidai, very influential situation, and so that the Japan can enact a collective self-defense. But is combined command constitutional in the current constitution? And also, is there any discussion about a constitutional amendment during the upper house election or in the current Japanese society?
Thank you for the question. At least at my knowledge, there's no strong argument and discussion to amend the Japanese constitution, especially Article 9. Of course, there's many conservative politicians which have maintained this agenda as a political priority, but it's not strong. It's what I am sharing with you is really like the Japanese argument, but it depends on the flexible interpretation of the Article 9 of the Constitution. The Article 9 itself doesn't prohibit Japan or the Japanese self-defense forces to join the combined command and control. It depends on whether or not the situation, Japan will be involved will confront if the situation, the response to the situation is in the realm of the constitutional right, the combined forces would be legally possible, but it is not the issue of legality. It is the issue of political one, and it is an issue of military operations or the priorities for Japan to participate in such combined operations, or whether or not it has to prioritize the defense of the Honshu, the territory, the main territory of Japan. So it is a military and political issue, not the legal issue.
For people who don't know, Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which was written by American lawyers, said American lawyers from the State Department who had worked on the Treaty of Paris and outlawing war and were real idealists and came in during the occupation to design a constitution that would make for a peaceful Japan and put into the Constitution things they couldn't get in to U.S. law or the U.S. Constitution, including women's rights, among other things. But the Article 9 says that Japan renounces the right of war to resolve international disputes. And then the second clause says that Japan will not maintain air, ground, and naval forces for that purpose. So that's why they're the Japan Defense Forces, because they're for defense of Japan. And that's why 10 years ago, Abe was able to reinterpret, as it was a matter of political will. This had never been tested in the Supreme Court. It was a bureaucratic and political decision. So Abe 10 years ago, and there were protests, and there were Buddhist monks and he survivors of Hiroshima protesting, but Abe pushed through in the Diet a set of laws that reinterpreted Article 9 to say, no, actually you can engage in collective defense. Because the UN Charter says every country has the right of collective and individual self-defense, and the Japanese Constitution is based on the UN Charter. So my view of this one is there's a lot of flexibility, and it really comes down to political will. And saying it's about Article 9 is just sort of like, when I ask my son to clean up after dinner and he says he has to study for the HSC. It's not really a legal problem at the end of the day. It's a matter of political will. Sorry? Well, he didn't personally draft it, but it was when he was the commander of GHQ. And the Americans were very divided about Japan. There were these New Deal idealists who'd come of age in the 20s and 30s designing the Locarno Treaty and stuff, outlawing war. And then there were others who were growing worried about communism and the coming Cold War. And so there was a real schizophrenia in the American occupation. But the Constitution itself was mostly written by the idealists and was embraced by the Japanese people. They were sick of war. And as long as the United States had the preponderance of power in the Pacific and Japan didn't have to make hard decisions, it was okay. And what's happened is the US doesn't have that anymore. And what motivated Abe as much as anything was not, in my view, worry the US couldn't handle it without more help from Japan. Yeah. Other questions? We have a few minutes. Yes, in the back.
I visited Japan about 2 weeks ago. I visited Kobe, Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto. One of the things that really stood out to me was how international Japan is becoming. You see people including Chinese, Africans, Ecuadorians, Aussies, Russians. Do you think with closer defense ties with Australia, and the economic challenges that Japan faces with infrastructure spending, aging population, low fertility rates, do you think the Japanese economy will open up more and more in the future? And will we see closer ties in terms of visas, in terms of working rights, like we see with the US, like the E3 visa for Australians?
I think Japan will, to a certain extent, will be more open to the international sources of manpower, the labor. Even I think the supply chains of defense production, the areas where the manpower is lacking, and probably the Japanese companies will need to consider to accept more international sources, a source of labor, depending on what types of work, what types of production, what types of engineering technologies are dealt with.
You know, of the G7 countries, US, Britain, Canada, and so forth, Japan has the lowest average tariff rate, which is remarkable. My first job in government was in the US trade office fighting with Japan when Japan had the highest tariff rate. So it really has opened in many ways. And it's true, when you go to even small towns in Japan, you see, you go into a 7-Eleven, and it's sort of a miracle if you see a Japanese working there. But the immigration is not, it doesn't have the visas you're describing yet. And it'll be interesting. Ogi-san, what do you think of Sanseito, this small but quite, I mean, they make MAGA look tame, this right-wing party in Japan that among other things was very anti-immigration. And they got, what, 13 seats? They're not a big party, but they grew the fastest. Is that a marginal thing, you think, in this whole debate?
I think it's marginal thing. For instance, some European media, reports this Sanseito movement in a context, in an analogy of the immigrant issue in Europe. But I don't think that is at the current stage, there is a huge, politically, socially dividing issue. Rather than the immigration issue, as I said earlier, the real the problem of the shift of the support from the LDP to Sanseito or Democratic Party, Party for People, DPP, is the dissatisfaction with the government's social security policy. Rather than the nationality difference,
and sort of like MAGA, especially young men, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that I think some of the reporting I've seen that has been asking the question, is this kind of Japan's populist political moment? Is this the moment that kind of American-style political populism arrives in Japan? It's not the first time we've seen a populist style of politics emerge in the Japanese system. I mean, Junichiro Koizumi was a bit of a maverick leader himself, but then there are other parties who have been in the electoral system for some time, like Isshin-no-kai, for example, from Osaka. It's not an entirely new development.
We have time for maybe one more. Yes, please. We'll do two, and then we'll answer them both. So we'll get both you guys, please.
Thank you for providing me such opportunity. So I have a question about the future development of Japan Self-Defense Forces expenditure. So especially regarding the next version of defense build-up program. So as mentioned earlier, the current version of defense build-up program will conclude in 2027. And thinking of the growing pressure from the US, I expect we will see a more detailed discussion in Japan toward the next version of the program to expand their defense budget or expenditure, and perhaps maybe it references to the NATO's framework, which is 30.5% for defense-related expenditure, and another 1.4% for more broad national defense expenditure. So my question is that if Japan decided to expand its defense budget in such, despite of the current domestic political challenges, which specific capabilities or equipment will be the major menu for the next defense build-up program?
Okay, yeah, good question. And we'll slip in one more if you, right here, just down. Yeah, why don't we do a quick?
Yeah. As for the first question, definitely I think the most important capability is the maritime asymmetrical capability. That's a kind of a Japanese maritime version of the Ukrainians' spider web operations. So we are actually the national defense strategy in 2022 articulated that Japan needs to have a symmetrical advantage over the adversary, but we haven't seen the specific force structures and the units dedicated to such radical asymmetrical capabilities. We need to really think about combining drones and the small ships and undersea vehicles to offset the quantitative superiority of the adversary. That is the answer for
Which, Tom, is pretty much the same thing in Australia, right?
Yeah, basically. Cheap asymmetric capabilities we can acquire at scale yesterday.
There's a U.S.-Japan initiative to link up innovative Japanese small, medium-sized enterprises that do drones and cyber and tech to make it easier for them to sell things to the defense forces and the Pentagon. And that's going to be expanded trilaterally next year to Australian companies as well to get those capabilities, because the big giant primes take a long time to build things. On the tariffs, watch this space. The 15% tariff on Japan, 10% on Australia. I don't know how much it's making the press here, but this is being challenged in the courts in the US. And I would say there's at least a 50-50 chance it's declared unconstitutional and the whole thing comes apart. Then Trump has to go to the Congress and say, you need to, because under the US Constitution, the Congress determines tariff rates. And then Trump would have to go to the Congress sometime next year before a midterm election where Republicans, his party, are really in trouble and say, by the way, I need you now to pass legislation authorizing these tariffs. Right now, 60% of Americans oppose the tariffs and the inflation's just hitting. So I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder whether Ishii and the Japanese government thought, yeah, all right, we'll sign something for now. The other thing is there's this $550 billion, President Trump calls it his sovereign wealth fund, that he will personally, don't invest in that. Just so we'll see. But it does put Australia in a very interesting position that Japan and Korea and others are moving quickly, and the Australian government's been a little bit more taking its time. We'll see if that works. They thought they had 10% tariffs, and now all of a sudden pharmaceuticals popped up. So that's why Japan and Australia need each other, among other reasons. Ogi-san, terrific having you here. Tom, thank you. We're going to Canberra tomorrow, and there's with Yuki Tatsumi from Washington, there's very high-level interest in the Australian government in this topic and real appetite to move forward. And I want to thank the Consul General for joining us. It's a great honor. And I'm surprised are you finished partying? But thanks for joining us. And thanks to Takada-san, Shizuka, our Japan Research Associate. So thank you. More to follow. We have a lot on our website on this. Thank you.